2 months after Afghanistan's parliamentary elections, the country's most senior prosecutor says he will look into claims of fraud. Afghanistan's most senior prosecutor has announced an investigation into claims of ballot fraud in the country's recent parliamentary election. His announcement came hours after the Afghan Election Commission released the final results for all but one of the country's 34 provinces. Since the election, almost a quarter of all votes have been cancelled and 24 candidates disqualified amid allegations of fraud. A bomb killed a NATO soldier in southern Afghanistan, raising the number of troop deaths this month to 46. And the Pentagon's latest report to the US Congress on the Afghanistan war says, quote, there's been a, quote, steady increase in total violence over the past 9 months. But as Tom Ackerman reports, the Pentagon also says that was expected.
The report to Congress covers a period between April and the end of September. It cites a 55% rise in the number of explosive incidents over the previous quarter, most of them attributed to the coalition's accelerated pace of operations and an upsurge of attacks during the parliamentary election campaign. Despite the jump in violence, civilian casualties are reported down from previous reporting periods. But the command also concedes that the Taliban has extended its presence in the north and west of the country. On the positive side, it highlights the growth of Afghan security forces, noting that recruitment of police and soldiers is running ahead of target. And it credits those forces with assuming a bigger role in the ongoing operations to drive the Taliban from their strongholds in Kandahar and Helmand provinces. That trend is continuing, a NATO spokesperson said on Wednesday.
They are pushing out the insurgents. We are seeing some great success in our SOF operations and our Special Operations Force operations, actually throughout Afghanistan, but certainly in the Kandahar region as well. And we're seeing the process going from a clearance to a hold.
But the share of surveyed Afghans, 20%, who rate their security situation as bad, is at a peak not seen since polling began 2 years ago. A Pentagon official says that dissatisfaction is just a reflection of the progress made in uprooting the Taliban from areas which they held unchallenged. Afghans, meanwhile, saw no progress in the fight against corruption. 8 in 10 people surveyed said their lives were personally touched by corruption. Tom Ackerman, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Masood Aziz joins us now. He's a former Afghan diplomat. He was the senior advisor at the Afghan embassy here in the US. So, as far as this report is concerned, the US is suggesting that there's more violence and more discontent because of how successful the campaign is going. Is that what they're saying?
Well, it's interesting that the report, that's right, is actually stating a number of things that are describing that there's a setback, in fact, in what's happening. And for example, it says that fighting has failed to convince the local population of Afghanistan that the U.S. forces, NATO, and Afghan forces are actually winning and turning things around. So it's very sobering from that perspective that is actually admitting these things.
But yet it's saying that's just because they're being introduced to fighting which they might not have seen before. I suppose that's their suggestion, even though hearts and minds were supposed to be quite important, I thought.
That's right. And also in the press conferences that followed the release of the report, folks were saying from the Pentagon and others that recently there's actually been a progress, that the report is kind of sort of backward looking, but recently, so there's a confusion in messages actually what is going on. But the reality is that things are not going very well, despite the troops that we have now in Afghanistan, in the south.
But they do say that, for example, Marja, which is supposed to be a test case of General Petraeus' new strategy, that has now stabilized. Is that credible then?
Well, that may be credible, but remember, Marja is a very small place in Afghanistan. It's so small that it's probably not relevant, but it is in the Helmand area. So stabilizing Marja with 30,000 troops may be a possibility, but then we have Kandahar, we have Ghazni, we have the entire south to stabilize, and that's a whole different issue.
Do you think part of the confusion there is we get these reports, these status reports, but and we have a review process underway apparently for President Obama, which will report in December, and yet apparently the strategy for the next few years has already been announced. This doesn't really seem to have much of a bearing on any of that.
Right. Well, the report is a regular report. We're going to have these reports. Now, you're right. The review is coming up in December, but on the other hand, the review in December and sort of the strategy that has been in place and the 2011 date. Now all of that has been pushed aside because of this this past weekend we have the conference in NATO and pushing things to 2014. So what we're doing here is that we're saying, look, we want to do something by 2011, but no, then we say we're going to do it by 2014. We're sending confusing messages both to the local folks and to the region, and to the U.S. population. So as a whole, the strategy is now more and clearer than it was last year.
Great. Masood Aziz, thank you very much.
Sure.